Hey guys, what's up? Public here back with another video, and today I want to talk about AoE as a Shadow Priest. I wanted to kind of bring this up because I think recently a lot of people have been talking about, how the current design of Shadow Priest works inside of AoE and how some people miss Mindseer. I've even seen some crazy people talk about how they miss Searing Nightmare from Shadowlands, so I want to kind of dive in, give my thoughts on the subject, and see what we can do moving forward. Okay, so it's no secret that Shadow Priest AoE has definitely been on a roller coaster of sorts over the last several expansions, which I think isn't too surprising if you think about the way that the game has kind of changed. I think specifically in Legion with Mythic Plus coming out, I think that's kind of when people started to actually care about the AoE damage pattern as like a real thing in the game. I think beforehand, some specs could do AoE for sure, but it wasn't like a big part of the game. Like, sure, there were certain fights and raids that like that was good for, but dungeon content wasn't really high end before Legion, right? There was no way to like farm it for high gear like we do today. It's less of like a game mode inside of the game at the time as well. So I think ever since then, dot specs in general have kind of been, I want to say, struggling, but effectively trying to find a healthy identity within the game. Shadow Priest has kind of gone through the gambit of lots of different things that they've kind of tried to make work. I think Legion was probably arguably one of the worst damage patterns that we had just because it kind of first came out, hit the scene, and it was a big struggle to kind of do anything, especially with that model of Void Form. I think BFA was probably when we had the most success with how things worked. And even then, it had its moments where things were awkward. And then I think Shadowlands was really the kind of expansion of experimentation where they were kind of trying out lots of different things. We got newer spells like Psychic Link, and we had Searing Nightmare added, and they were just kind of trying to find something that made the spec work in AoE. And then we go all the way up to Dragonflight, where we kind of experimented with Mindseer in like a different form as a Insanity Spender. It was all just kind of weird. And then we could also take Psychic Link in Season 1. And then, of course, Season 2 comes along. We had a little bit of a rework, and Mindseer is gone now. So we've definitely gone through lots of different iterations, but I want to talk about where we're at now and kind of where I think the spec could afford to go in the future. I think, removing Mindseer straight up, I think was definitely one option that we kind of were pitching as a community. I don't think it necessarily is totally a bad thing, but I do think a lot of players did like that choice of saying, I have that like Psychic Link, Blade Flurry style of AoE, or I had Mindseer. So I do wonder if Mindseer could maybe come back just as a choice node with Psychic Link maybe, or something else in the tree. Just because I think a lot of people are kind of missing, I'll say, simple AoE. But that being said, I think Psychic Link is a very unique spell in the sense, other than Blade Flurry, we're kind of the only spec in the game that operates that way. I think where the frustration has lied with a lot of people is that it's kind of a tuning nightmare in some ways, meaning if Blizzard's not on top of things with tuning, I feel like Psychic Link kept falling in this trap where it was either too good or not good enough. And I think like that sweet spot of Psychic Link usually takes them several rounds of hot fixes to get into a good state. I think that can make it kind of frustrating for players when it's like, that's our AoE, really. I think that's kind of the current state of where that's at. So I don't want to say that I'm never wanting to go back to Mindseer, but I do think that kind of damage pattern of Psychic Link is worth keeping around. Now, I think the biggest flaw with the current AoE system that we have today is actually not really directly with Psychic Link. I think it's actually with our dots specifically. And I think in general, we just have a slew of unsatisfying dot management plaguing the spec right now. Pun not intended. So I think most of this comes from Shadow Crash, right? If you missed your Shadow Crash, or if you don't have Shadow Crash available to apply dots with those Whispering Shadows, you are just having a bad time. And I think that's kind of the core problem with the spec right now, is that it's kind of living and dying on that as an ability. So they have changed the cooldown to make it more, easier to get into the spec for sure, but it still has a problem of like, if you happen to miss a Shadow Crash, or if you don't time it correctly, you're just losing a ton of damage because we need our dots to activate our AoE. I brought this up in a previous video, but you kind of have that choice, right, between making dots powerful or making them easy to spread. We're definitely in the kind of more easy to spread camp right now. I think personally where I'd like to see the spec go with this, though, is to give us more options for dot management. So today, you just have Shadow Crash. That's like, it's basically it. You also have Misery, but Misery is kind of a required talent. It doesn't really feel like it's doing a whole lot these days, and it's definitely not as central to our AoE. And a lot of that's really dependent on dungeon design, which I feel like has been creeping up mob counts more and more. So I think Misery, also isn't really doing much. So yeah, that's what we have today, right? That's our baseline. We have those two spells. But what we don't have is dot extensions without Void Form. If you're not inside of Void Form, or if you're not talenting it, we don't have a way to extend our dots in AoE. We did have Mental Decay that did that in Season 1, but since they reworked it, Mental Decay is basically just a single target talent. So I think reinvigorating Mental Decay to have that kind of AoE dot extension again would be really powerful and make this spec feel a whole lot better, so that way you don't need to feel like you have to re-Shadow Crash in the middle of a pack. Another thing to think about too is we also have a talent called Unfurling Darkness that's sitting on the tree. I do also think if they gave that a bit of love, they could actually make that desirable in PvE from like a dot spreading perspective. Maybe some way of like making Vampiric Touch instant cast every so often, or something. I'm not sure what exactly would make sense, but I do think having an alternative or additional way to spread dots other than just Shadow Crash would be healthy for the spec. So I think if they kind of solve dot spreading, and the more that they crank on that, Psychic Link will just continue to feel better for players. That being said, I think our other spells in the kit could also use some love and attention, especially if you don't want to just go in that direction with our AoE. The first one for me is Shadowy Apparitions full stop. I think we definitely have some talents in the kit that work around Shadowy Apparitions, and we even have a tier set that's probably coming back in Season 4 with that as well. But I wish that you could build the Shadow Priest in a way that Shadowy Apparitions became the central part of your AoE kit, clearly. I don't think we quite have that today. I think travel time can be part of the problem there, and I think just in general, the damage they deal is lacking. I think one of the pitches that we were always talking about, I think we'd love to see happen, is have something where Shadowy Apparitions actually explode for AoE damage as they hit the target, and kind of giving you a reason to build around them more. I think that'd be really fun. I don't know if it'd be too powerful to have that coexist with Psychic Link. So again, maybe that needs to be a choice node with Psychic Link or something like that. If they could make it work, that's great. But I do think we're kind of, one of the problems with our AoE right now is that we have so many like little things adding up that don't really make the spec feel cohesive. So I feel like what Psychic Link has done in the past, and I think today to a certain extent, depending on your build, it is like clearly your best AoE damage button, damage ability. And so I don't like the like a bunch of small things adding up thing. I think it feels a little more unsatisfying when that's been the case in the past. So yeah, would love to see more iteration on Shadowy Apparitions, specifically from like an AoE build standpoint. I think, again, we already mentioned kind of the dots thing. I think it'd be cool to experiment again with like dots. It kind of feels like Blizzard's terrified of making dots relevant or like powerful in AoE specifically, which is why they've kind of leaned into their easy to spread camp. And that's not just a Shadow thing, by the way. Almost every dot spec in the game has leaned from dots are powerful to they're just really easy to spread. So I do think, it'd be interesting to play around with that, but I think in order for them to be successful and to do it safely, what they would have to do is kind of have some kind of AoE cap on the dot, which I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to. I think you have similar problems with Shadow Crash, right? Of saying like, well, Shadow Crash is at 8 targets, that doesn't feel great. You could uncap Shadow Crash, but if you did that, Psychic Link would scale out of control. So I think the answer there would be you could square root scale Psychic Link. After a certain amount of targets, it scales its damage. Dots could work somewhat similarly, although I think this could end up frustrating players if not done well. If you aren't aware, there are a few dots in the game that actually do this. The one that Priest had was Unholy Nova in Shadowlands, where when you casted the dot, depending on how many targets you casted it on, it actually changed how much damage it did so that it didn't scale linearly with targets. That way it didn't scale out of control. So that's something they could think about bringing back. I know that could definitely solve some things. But again, I think it'd be an interesting choice if we could choose between powerful dots or easy to spread dots. Right now it feels like we're in that easy to spread camp, but it still doesn't feel great. So I don't know. They could work on that for sure. The next thing to bring up with our AoE kit is Inescapable Torment. So this is somewhat, I don't want to say controversial. I think it's more that people are just tired of playing with it. But it is a core part of our AoE, at least in a lot of builds right now, especially with the current Season 3 tier set. I think personally, this is actually probably the best iteration of Mindbender Shadow Fiend gameplay that the spec has ever had over the course of its history. That being said, it's not doing a whole lot because those base spells themselves are pretty lackluster. So yeah, but I do think Inescapable Torment could live and breathe a bit more on its own. It is kind of a very relatively small part of our AoE, so I do think if they really liked this playstyle, I think more people would actually enjoy it if it felt more powerful. Whereas today, it's kind of like a side thing that you don't really care about. So yeah, I'd like for them to experiment more with this. I think you could also say that the target caps here are really hurting it, for at least unlocking its ability to be powerful, especially with the current tier set. So yeah, if it's going to be there, I think I'd like it to be a bit more powerful or meaningful at least. And finally, the last thing to bring up as far as our AoE is Idol of N'Zoth. So again, we have lots of AoE components, but I think Idol of N'Zoth, you know, has some rough edges, and I think for me personally, it's just like the double target capping here just makes it feel icky. So if you don't know, you're limited to 4 debuffs at a time with this, and the damage is actually soft capped at 5. So it's kind of like that like I said, that's a double target cap effectively, and it just feels like this thing's always doing like 4% of my damage in AoE. It just feels super minor, even if you're taking Screams of the Void, which theoretically helps its damage. So I don't know. I think I'm just kind of sad. I wish it was a bit more powerful or like part of our kit. I think there are lots of different ways that you could change this or you know, edit it. I think some of this is like quality of life stuff, like when a target hits 10 stacks, it immediately causes a detonation instead of you having to roll the detonation proc. That would make it a whole lot better. Another thing, and this could be a choice node with the existing Idol of N'Zoth to kind of choose how it works, is to give it an active ability. Basically saying, by default, you know, the stacks don't explode unless you press this active ability, and then when you press that, then you trigger a detonation, effectively giving us the agency over the AoE damage. I think that could also be really, really fun. And then I think the other thing is just revisiting the caps. I think the caps just make it not fun, and I think really kind of struggle, especially on the target cap only being applied to four targets. I think can cause some problems, and not the biggest fan of that. So yeah, that's AoE as a Shadow Priest. There's a lot going on, and I think that's not an accident, and that's kind of what I wanted to bring up, is that there's just so many parts to our AoE. That's what I think makes it feel kind of incoherent today. You have Mind Seer, we used to have Searing Nightmare, I think Shadowy Apparitions to an extent, Psychic Link, dot spreading, dots in general. Like, there's just so much going on. I think it's hard to like wrap your head around like what Blizzard wants the spec to be in AoE, and so I hope in the next expansion we can get some iteration on that. But that's AoE's the Shadow Priest. Hopefully this video was interesting. I'm really curious in the comments below though, because I think this is always my favorite experiment. Let me know your favorite iteration of Shadow Priest AoE in the comments, because I think there's probably going to be quite a large list of different builds that people think that they had the most fun on. So I'm curious what you guys think. That's all we have for this video. We'll see you in the next one.